I'm Locke Meredith. I'd like to invite you to join me on the next Legal Lines, where my guest is Colonel Robert Maness. Colonel Maness is running for the Louisiana House seat for District 77. He's going to tell us why. He's also going to talk about suicide and the difficulty of serving in the military and then becoming part of the civilian force. So join us on the next Legal Lines with Colonel Robert Maness.
It's time now for Legal Lines Tips with your host, Locke Meredith.
Hello, I'm Locke Meredith, and I have a Legal Lines tip for you. Remember, knowledge is power. And I want you to know if you're injured, Louisiana law grants you a variety of claims to make sure you're fully compensated. It's generally chopped up into several categories, the first being general damages. That's going to compensate you for your mental and physical pain and suffering, your scarring, disability, functional limitations, your loss of enjoyment of life. Also, it will compensate your family, frankly, for your loss of affection. It's called loss of consortium claim. Next category is specific damages. Those would be, say, for example, past and future lost wages, past and future medical expenses. You also have a claim sometimes for what's called punishment damages or punitive damages, typically only available when you're injured by a drunk party. Finally, you're entitled to legal interest from the date you file your lawsuit until you're paid and court costs. So my Legal Lines tip to you from me, Locke Meredith, make sure you know what your claims are.
This has been Legal Lines Tips with your host, Locke Meredith.
Hello, welcome to Legal Lines. I'm Locke Meredith, and I'm very pleased to have back on the show Colonel Rob Maness. Rob, it's great to see you again.
It's good to be back with you, Locke.
Tell the folks a little bit about yourself. You decided to run for District 77, the House seat for the state of Louisiana, and we'll get into that. But give folks a little bit of your background. A lot of folks are going to know who you are, but some may not.
You know, I was born into a military family. My dad and mom were from Southwest Tennessee, the McNairy County, Madison County area. Yeah, and but I traveled around along with my three brothers with them until I was about 14. Then he retired, and I spent 3 years in West Tennessee until I got out of high school at age 17, and I enlisted in the Air Force.
And got chosen for quite a job, I understand, in the Air Force.
Absolutely. Did bomb disposal work in the Air Force. It was an honor to get the opportunity to do that, but for a 17-year-old young man, it was also very exciting work.
Man, and I'd call that, I might choose a different word, but I understand.
You know, in professions, the folks inside the profession realize, at least in my case, that the better trained you are, even if it's a very, very exciting job, that excitement being external because enemies are trying to kill you all the time.
Right.
The more calm you are because you receive such good training. And our training is really the best training in the world in explosive ordnance disposal.
It's good to know these days with the craziness we're seeing everywhere.
Yeah, well, I finished college at night school.
Well, and tell the folks about your education too, because it's extraordinary the education you got by going into the military.
That's right. I was very fortunate. My dad could not afford to send his sons to college, so I was able to finish college at night school to get my first 2 undergraduate degrees. I got a 2-year degree in mathematics and a 4-year degree in management information systems. And after that, I was fortunate enough to get selected for officer training and flying training, and I graduated from officer training in early 86, and went on to train as an airborne navigator. I navigated jet aircraft. The first one was tankers, air refueling aircraft right here in Louisiana at Barksdale Air Force Base. That was my first time, at least to my knowledge, that I was in Louisiana. My dad was stationed here at Fort Polk for a short period of time when he was a very young man, but I don't think I was here with him. Anyway.
Well, you're leaving out an important one too. You had a little education from Harvard.
Well, I did. And after I left tankers and went over to fly the B-1, my second year there, I was able to get accepted for Harvard University's Kennedy School, the John F. Kennedy School, and got to spend a year there getting a master's degree in public administration and really getting a master's level education in all things not related to the U.S. military, which, as you can imagine, was very interesting.
I bet it was.
It was very interesting, but it was also very broadening. You know, we believe in deepening and broadening your knowledge, your education background,
knowledge is power.
and your ability. Right. So you need to have depth and you need to be broad, and that's why the military gave me the opportunity to do that. And I got a 1-year leave of absence to do it. But that was just my first master's degree. As I went along, I was selected for Air Force colleges. The first level is the Staff College, Command and Staff College, and I was in the first class to ever be awarded a master's degree from Air Command and Staff College in operational
honors, right?
science. With honors, yes. Absolutely.
And cum laude in your undergraduate degree.
Cum laude in my undergraduate degree, and after that we went to the Pentagon.
And there during 9/11, as I recall.
Yeah, I was a staff officer, what's called a nuclear operations officer. I was one of the 7 men and women that had the responsibility to write the President's Nuclear Decision Handbook. You know it as the nuclear football that's carried in the briefcase with the military aid at 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
I didn't know that.
I'm actually responsible for writing 3 pages in that book because I was responsible for the plan that went into those 3 pages. And we were responsible for training the military aides and the President and all of the principles that are required to have the book, because under succession planning, you know, the Vice President's got to have a copy, and et cetera.
That's a heavy responsibility.
So it was, and I was one of 7 Americans charged with that, and was the junior one actually in those days. But you know, it was an awesome responsibility and an awesome, exciting job to get to do. And then 9/11 happened. I was in the Pentagon on 9/11, and it was a terrible day for America.
Yeah.
But it was also a day that retaught me something that I already knew I was taught, is that Americans always go to the fight. They don't run away from a fight. And that day at the Pentagon, you know, a group of us volunteered to go back inside the Pentagon into the courtyard after we were evacuated, and we took care of the injured and everything to help fight the fire and try to find more survivors. You know what? Everybody that was present volunteered to go back in, and when we went back in through the first corridor, the smoke was so thick we had to form a human chain to get through it.
Wow.
And use our T-shirts as smoke masks.
Had
and we
to
worked
be an
inside
amazing,
there all day fighting fires and looking for injured and
harrowing experience.
It was a harrowing experience, more so for my family than me being a professional person that's used to
right.
things going on
well,
like that around me.
You were a commander of an entire Air Force
Yeah, eventually, shortly after 9/11, I was brought into a group called the Future Operations Group to help plan the American response to the 9/11 attacks in Afghanistan. Once that was completed, and I was reassigned back to a B-1 bomber base and a B-1 bomber squadron, and eventually I took command of that squadron and was given the opportunity and the honor and privilege to lead young Americans back into combat to help fight the war that I helped plan.
And as I understand it, in charge of 22,000
eventually
employees.
I was, yeah. And B-1s, I had about 350 personnel and 14 aircraft. Each one of them worth $265 million that we could
wow.
deploy around the world, and we did. And we used them to hunt down America's enemies and, of course, kill them. And we did it very effectively. I'm very proud of them. We didn't take any losses. But we caused a lot of losses for the enemy. And eventually I got selected to go to the Navy War College and got my 3rd master's degree in national strategy from the Navy War College in Rhode Island. And after that I did 2 big jobs as a colonel. I was promoted to colonel 2 years early. And the first one was a vice wing commander at Offutt Air Force Base in Bellevue, Nebraska, just south of Omaha. That's the home of the Air Force's largest airborne intelligence wing. It has operations all around the world, has major organizations around the world in the Pacific, the European theater. We had a squadron deployed in 1990 to the Middle East, and it's still there today. It rotates personnel and equipment every 90 days. And then after that, I got selected to come back to Barksdale to create the Air Force's new nuclear command. We had problems with our nuclear mission, so I was asked to come in as a deputy director and build the budget, which was about $7.8 billion.
B as in billion.
Build the budget and shepherd it through the congressional approval process, and also help establish the requirements for all and the strategic plan for the command for the next 25 years that they're operating with now. And that was at Barksdale Air Force Base too. And then my last job was as a wing commander, the one you were referring to, Locke, where we had 23,000 personnel and their families at Kirtland Air Force Base in New Mexico. 52,000 plus acres of land, my own electrical grid, 3.5 nuclear reactors, a police force of 600 personnel.
Let's continue it on the next segment. Retired after 32 years. This is Locke Meredith on Legal Lines with Colonel Robert Maness. We'll be right back.
It's time now for Legal Lines Tips with your host, Locke Meredith.
Hello, I'm Locke Meredith with a Legal Lines tip for you. Document your claim. What do I mean? Whenever you present a claim, whether it's for injuries in an automobile collision or for a breach of contract case or a business claim, it all boils down to documentation and evidence. For example, when you go to trial, basically both sides are presenting their evidence of what they believe to be their case. For example, also, if you're involved in an automobile collision, document the event. Talk to all the parties who are involved. Get their names, address, contact information, insurance info. Talk to the witnesses on the scene. Also get their contact information. Take photographs. With the phones we all have these days, everybody can take a picture and that paints 1,000 words. So document your claim. The Legal Lines tip from me, Locke Meredith, to you is document the claim.
This has been Legal Lines Tips.
Welcome back to Legal Lines. I'm Locke Meredith, and again, very pleased to have back on the show Colonel Rob Maness. We're talking about his experience in the military, 32 years, quite an experience, all kinds of different roles, from the bottom to almost the extreme top.
Yeah.
And you retire, and you've seen a lot of stuff, you've done a lot of stuff, and going from the military world and the high sentinel kind of emotions and senses you develop, and into the civilian world where nobody really knows what you've done or the positions you've held or the sacrifices you've made. That's hard.
Well, sure, it's tough, but it's something that we all, all of us, they call us lifers, or used to anyway. We all know that it's going to come because the military is a young man and woman's game. I was 49 years old when I retired after 32 years. So we're well prepared for that. But what you're not prepared for is the remembrance of all of the experiences and not necessarily prepared for the effect that they've had on you personally and your condition, your mindset, how you think, how you act in family relationships or business relationships. And it can be quite tough because, as you mentioned, I saw things as a bomb disposal specialist from when I was 17 years old all the way as a senior commander, where I was giving orders that were killing a lot of people, and I had to deal with what's called the bomb damage assessment from those, and that involves looking at
God, I didn't
what
even
my folks
contemplate
accomplished,
Yeah.
and you don't really contemplate it until you actually live through it. Most people
It's not
don't.
something we would ever do.
No, and nowadays when we deploy people, we deploy them for 6 months, a year, and those kind of things. And in World War II, we sent the young men and women out for the duration.
Years.
Well, we can't do that now because of the way we're structured or organized. We've been in this war for almost 17 years.
That's right.
Can you imagine being gone all that time?
I think I calculated using 330 million United States citizens that about 5 out of every 10,000 citizens of America serve in the military.
That's right.
Nobody knows what our military does for us and what their families sacrifice.
It's less than 1% now.
It's incredible.
It's less than 1%. But they honor us and they respect us like no other generation has been respected now. It's amazing the love and affection you get from the American people.
And
these
yet,
days.
you and I both know there's this extraordinarily sad and high suicide rate. What I read is between 20 and 22 suicides every single day, like one every 65 minutes.
Yeah.
And your thoughts on that? Is that a correct number?
I think it's probably close, but we think it's actually higher because of reporting issues with the way deaths are recorded in the civilian world versus the military world. The Veterans Administration has never really liked to report their suicide rates. There are a lot of veterans that are part of that suicide rate that are disconnected from the VA or military life now and have been for many years.
So nobody knows about them.
Nobody knows about them.
In fact, Rob, I read a statistic that said age 49 down, a third of the suicides come from, and from age 50 and up, about 70%.
Yes, a lot of people
incredible.
realized that the 22 a day started being talked about in 2012, 2013 time frame. What they didn't realize is that those 22 a day were primarily Vietnam combat veterans. that had not really been diagnosed and treated for post-traumatic stress. Today we have a lot of good mechanisms, although we still have our challenges. You know, I for one didn't report until I retired because I had jobs that I needed to get done.
And when you say report that you were having struggles?
That you might have post-traumatic stress, and we try to encourage senior officers that are on active duty to set a good example today, but it's tough because you could lose your job, you could lose your livelihood, and you
employers
could lose the
when you get out
and
might be
employers
scared
when you get out. Yeah, and afterwards, you know, you've probably heard the stories about regulations being passed or signed off on by the president saying you could take your gun rights away if a veteran, and veterans need to be looked at closely. Well, keep in mind, veterans with post-traumatic stress are being continuously redeployed back to the combat zone and are very trustworthy when it comes to the use of force and arms and those kinds of things. So the veterans community really pushes back on that idea because we want people to feel comfortable reporting even when they're on active duty, because the year I left active duty, I think I told you, Locke, the Army lost 349 or so active duty soldiers in a 365-day period. The Air Force, it was over 200. My last command, we lost a 19-year-old young airman to suicide, and it's terrible. And it's terrible that the folks are not reporting in all cases, and when they are reporting, the Veterans Administration has some good programs, but we really haven't figured out how to treat it without using things like medication. There are a lot of medication cocktails that are being passed around.
Some worry that may make the problem worse.
And what we've seen is the medication regime that the VA uses does make the problem worse, especially in the young combat veterans coming back. What works best is what's called peer-to-peer counseling.
Relationships.
Somebody that's been through a similar experience, counseling that individual, and that gets to the organizations that one of them I helped found. It's called the Military Advocacy Project of Louisiana. I'm a founding board member of it. We were focused on seeking out, in our case, Guard and Reserve combat veterans that had been recently redeployed that were being reported as having problems, so that we could get them peer-to-peer counseling. And we had volunteers that we lined up. We didn't spend a whole lot of money doing it. We just organized ourselves and tried to reach out to the community. But there are other organizations now that are even better. There's one over in Texas that's I'm really close to. It's called the PTSD Foundation. They have a camp right outside of Houston called Camp Hope. If you Google them, get their phone number. Anybody in need. Camp Hope
in Texas.
It's founded by a guy named Gene Birdwell, who's a good friend of mine. He's just a good American construction guy, businessman. His company's right there by the compound that he built. Called Camp Hope, and you just Google it, find the phone number, and call it, and they'll figure out a way to get you there, and that takes care of a lot of veterans.
We're going to put that on a banner on the show. Just make sure people have access to that.
And there's another organization that I help. It's called Crosswinds Foundation. It's got crosswindsfoundation.org. They're over in Alabama, and that's a faith-based program, but they're using the similar approaches, just trying to educate folks on what this issue is, what the different levels of the issues are, and I try to help those organizations and help us anytime a veteran's in need and I find out about it. I try to connect them with the right services.
Talk to the folks about kind of the strain on the relationships that you have back home, both when you're gone and then when you come home, and then you go through that multiple times. I know your wife indicated to you there was a big moment for y'all in your
Oh yeah. I had my last part of my career, even though I was considered the old man then by the troops at age 40. I had my own struggles with post-traumatic stress because I was deploying, coming home, In a 3-year period, I had a son born that we almost lost while I was on a combat deployment. Wow. I left him when he was a month and a half old on my last combat deployment.
All right, well, we'll continue this on the next segment. This is Locke Meredith with Legal Lines and my guest, Colonel Rob Maness. We'll be right back.
It's time now for Legal Lines Tips with your host, Locke Meredith.
Hello, I'm Locke Meredith with a Legal Lines tip for you. Document your claim. What do I mean? Whenever you present a claim, whether it's for injuries in an automobile collision or for a breach of contract case or a business claim, it all boils down to documentation and evidence. For example, when you go to trial, basically both sides are presenting their evidence of what they believe to be their case. For example, also, if you're involved in an automobile collision, document the event. Talk to all the parties who are involved. Get their names, address, contact information, insurance info. Talk to the witnesses on the scene. Also get their contact information. Take photographs. With the phones we all have these days, everybody can take a picture and that paints 1,000 words. So document your claim. The Legal Lines tip from me, Locke Meredith, to you is document the claim.
This has been Legal Lines Tips.
Welcome back to Legal Lines. I'm Locke Meredith. Again, pleased to have back on the show Colonel Rob Maness. He is running for House Representative, District 77. Before we get into that, Rob, let's kind of finish up our discussion about suicide. There was a big moment for you, and what it all boiled down to is you decided to ask for help.
Absolutely. You know, after I retired from the military, I went to work for Entergy, which was not a low-stress job as Director of Safety and Training for their utility operation. But you know, I just felt like that I had these issues, and I wasn't sure exactly what it was, but I knew what the symptoms were. And in my work with veterans and with the charity organizations, I realized that I probably needed to go ahead and get counseling. And I went to the VA, and the VA, you know, I've been critical of the VA, but in this particular case, the program here was able to refer me to a civilian research program over at Tulane, and I got some of the best counseling I could ever have.
That's great
but
news.
When the day I decided to do that, I told my wife.
A lot of support there.
And she said, I was wondering when you were going to do that. It's about time, because you realize that your interactions with the kids can be harsh sometimes, and your interactions with me and just everybody, and I don't think you realize how difficult that it can be.
Well, and the truth is, you've got 3 sons who have also served in the military. I think one is still serving, or
two still serving.
Okay, 2 still serving. At least the awareness now is antennas are up.
Oh, absolutely.
And you're able to guide them through the process, and hopefully a system is now being developed.
That was the best decision I ever made. The counseling was effective, and now I can even talk with more credibility as a peer-to-peer counselor and with other veterans that might be suffering from those issues and being silent, and their families too.
And it's a collision, I guess. We've talked about it before, that there's kind of this military mindset, human mindset that develops that, hey, you know, I need to suck it up and not moan or ask for help, and you're scared your comrades are going to look down on you, and there's consequences, as you mentioned, from the government. You know, they're going to somehow be penalized either at work or lose rights. So it just takes the counseling to help you work through all of that.
Yeah. And I recommend that if you're on active duty or if you're an active guard and reserve, that you seek help. Don't be afraid to do that. You're not going to lose your job. You're probably not going to miss that next deployment. That's the biggest fear, really, is missing the next deployment, because that's what we volunteer to do. We're all volunteers and professionals today. So I encourage folks to do that. I encourage senior officers to do it and do theirs publicly to set the right example for the younger troops. Because they need to see senior officers doing that, and that will change that mindset to go, okay, this is part of the profession. It's that way in the special operations world. The special operations world is the cutting edge in treatment of post-traumatic stress, and a lot of the models that they've used have been expanded to the VA and other systems.
Well, it's excellent, and I want to thank you on behalf of America, especially Louisiana, for your service.
Thank you.
Both in the military and, frankly, now that you want to serve in the public realm. Tell folks why.
Well, I mean, you nailed it. I just want to serve, you know. We saw an opportunity after some really good experiences this summer and the experiences in my life. You know, my experiences and skills are in collaborative leadership and solutions-oriented, constructive policymaking.
And you have relationships with federal leaders, state leaders, and local leaders.
My political activities have given me great relationships with leaders all around the state, all around the nation, really, that are just exceptional Americans, and I want to put that to use. I want to put my skills to use, and My state representative resigned about a month and a half ago, and when we saw that,
not much notice, huh?
When we saw that, we were considering running in a few years again if a good opportunity arose, because my wife and I know that I still want to serve, and I think I've got a lot to bring to the table to help Louisianans and Americans. So when Mr. Schroeder resigned, we took a look at it and polled the race, and really it was the right race for me to get into, and so now we're in. And I want to bring my relationships that I've established this spring. I was up at the legislature representing a citizens group, and I built relationships with the legislators, their staffs. They know me now. I can hit the ground running in the next session, and nobody knows when the governor's going to call the next special session. I would imagine it's probably going to be January. I'm ready to go now. We have a long list of legislative accomplishments from the sessions this past spring, and more importantly, we already have the relationships, and we have the ability with this collaborative leadership skill set and the ability to construct solutions-oriented policy. That's the legislator's primary function, is to construct solutions-oriented policy and be a leader in a way that leads people to find the area where you can agree on.
And where you hope you get the best decision.
Exactly. Everybody can stand on their principles. Absolutely, we should stand on our principles, but there's always going to be a corner of an argument where two opposing parties can find something they agree on. It takes collaborative leadership and the ability to construct policy from a solutions perspective and experience doing that, and the relationships needed to do that to be successful. And that's why we think we're the best candidate for the Times in House District 77.
And of course, your background in the military, you developed all those skills over decades. So what are the specific issues that you want to help District 77 address?
Well, my legislative priorities are to put West St. Tammany families first. That means looking at the number one issue more than anything else right now, which is drainage and flooding problems.
Right.
I hear that from every door I knock on.
And it is a big issue.
It's a big issue. But there's something at the state level that we can do. We can make sure that the parishes and the city governments have the resources they need, that they're doing the right planning, that we're looking far enough ahead on things like transportation planning and neighborhood planning, and we're looking at those first before we do anything else. We're looking at drainage and flooding, and then the next thing is traffic. And then having a business climate that creates jobs. That's taking care of West St. Tammany families first, and I think it will take care of Louisiana families at the same time. And then legislative priority 2 rolls right into that, and that's we need good tax policy reform, and we need it right now.
Not just raise taxes, right?
Yeah, we need it right now because we're losing jobs. We lost 600 jobs from Exxon to Corpus Christi, Texas this past spring because of what? Because they said the unstable economic environment is just not good for business. And there's two things related to that. Number one is tax policy, and number two is legacy lawsuits and the litigious nature of the environment here. So we need tort reform to get our civil lawsuit arena under control, and we need tax policy reform to make the state, instead of a repellent to business, an attractor to business. You get more flies from honey than you do vinegar.
Well, let's face it, states compete for businesses now, and they set aside millions, hundreds of millions of dollars in tax credits and benefits to make companies come pick them. And Texas is our next door neighbor, and they're the wealthiest state in the union. And they've set hundreds of millions aside, and they're getting a lot of folk. And we got to compete if we want to hang on to the jobs we have and increase it and grow.
That's absolutely right. And that rolls into my third legislative priority, and that is not to raise taxes. That includes budget reform. I agreed with the standstill budget approach that the House of Representatives took during the last session because they were right. Because they were right. The revenue estimating committee's always wrong, and we can't budget based on that. We've got to budget below it so we're not in a deficit.
Makes sense. Colonel, pleasure having you back on the show.
Thank you.
Look forward to seeing you again. This is Locke Meredith, Legal Lines, and my special guest, Colonel Rob Maness, running for District 77, House seat. Thank you for being with us.